we meet in an hour of change and challenge, in a decade of hope and fear, in an age of both knowledge and ignorance. If this capsule history of our progress teaches us anything, it is that man in his quest for knowledge and progress is determined and cannot be deterred. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
Welcome to another episode of the Energy Impact Podcast. Our guest today is Aparna Shrivastava, the Deputy Chief Climate Officer at the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation. Aparna, great to have you on.
Thanks so much. Really excited to be here.
Yeah, well, I'm excited to hear about all the cool work you're doing. But before we go there, tell us a little bit about you. Where are you from?
Thanks. Yeah. So I grew up mostly in Portland, Oregon. I was actually born in Salt Lake City, Utah, but then we moved to Portland when I was pretty young. And yeah, was very, very spoiled for having lots of trees and beautiful nature around me, along with lots of rain.
And did your family do outdoor activities? Like, were you hikers on the weekend or bikers, or like, what was your family? What was the thing?
Yeah, I mean, especially in college, I did a ton of hiking with my dad. He was very much into that as well. So lots of outdoor stuff growing up, and time in nature, which I was really grateful for. I studied, went to to Oregon State for my undergrad and went to high school there as well. I studied mechanical and environmental engineering in undergrad, which ended up getting me very much involved with the Engineers Without Borders chapter, which now looking back, I have a lot of issues with their model of development, but it did kind of spark that interest in development more broadly and just kind of international development issues. So that was cool, but yeah, I'd say Oregon mostly, yeah.
You're outdoorsy, you're walking around, like, where was the engineering kick here?
So it's a little bit random. I actually was always really interested in cars. I actually used to work at a mechanics shop. I used to shadow over the summer in high school, and I was really interested in becoming a mechanic. Generally, I loved working on cars. Nobody used to touch our family cars for like oil changes. I used to do them all myself with my dad. And I tried to.
So was he a car guy, or this was like organically you became a car person?
Yeah.
Can you pinpoint where that? Like, you just saw a car and were like, oh, that's super cool.
I just thought so. We were really lucky. So Tigard High School, where I went to high school, was one of the only high schools in Oregon that actually had an auto program. So there was an auto shop in our high school. And so when I took one of the basic auto classes, it kind of sparked this love of kind of tinkering and working and building and fixing things. And so I tried to tell my dad that I wanted to be a mechanic. And unsurprisingly, he was actually really supportive of it as an interest, but he said, go get a degree first. And then, then do what you want, but have a degree as a backup at least. And so the closest thing I could find to a mechanic was mechanical engineering. And so I ended up studying that. And basically along the way, got very much interested in specifically water and wastewater engineering. And that's kind of where the environmental side came out.
Amazing. And those feel like, while kind of linguistically connected, they are quite a bit different, right? Like, I imagine I've done a little bit of like work on cars, mostly because I was like, oh, I need to teach myself some of this. And what I loved about it was getting your hands dirty and like, it's kind of a filthy but fun activity. And you traded that for thermodynamics textbooks and like fluid dynamics, right? Like
I had no idea. I had no idea what I was signing up for, but
Okay,
then I
okay.
signed up for it and I just did it.
You were like, I'm going to finish this, and then you found some other loves from that, I guess, right? You're naturally curious. Okay, so tell us with Engineers Without Borders. You're like, I want to kind of get in the field. I want to do some things. How did that happen?
Yeah. It was like my freshman year, I got involved with the chapter, and then it became my main activity through all of undergrad. There were two different projects that the chapter was working on. One was a water access project specifically in El Salvador, and the other project was also a water access project in Western Kenya. And yeah, I mean, I think that is kind of where the interest in water access really kind of came from. And I think being able to work on those projects was very, very pivotal in my own kind of journey in working in international development. But honestly, looking back, I have a lot of issues with that type of model where you have kind of solutions that are kind of helicoptered in, and young people that maybe don't have a lot of technical knowledge or would not be trusted to be designing systems in their own countries, going to other countries. There's a lot of a lot of baggage and context that has to be considered. And so I definitely struggle with some of that type of involvement looking back now, but I'm grateful to have at least had the exposure. I have tried to work to rectify some of those things, but that's maybe a conversation for another time.
But let's go one level deeper. We don't have to go all the way deep, but yeah, like how do you weigh those trade-offs? Like clearly you were doing good things for the local community. And I know I have some friends that did Peace Corps that, talk about sort of that exploration process that they have. Like, what are some things that you've tried to push in engineers? What are some of the specific problems, that you've identified, and what are your proposed solutions as you've tried to rectify those?
Yeah, and honestly, I think it very much comes down to recognizing your own the intersections of privilege and power that we exhibit in ourselves, regardless of what the demographics we have. We do have some elements of privilege, and we do have some elements of power, depending on where we're born, how much money our families might have access to, or the education or networks, or whatever it is. There's race, class, etc., gender, sexual orientation. And I think recognizing the impact of our own privilege and power when we try to do good, whether that's perceptions of us or how people are, how many blind sights you might have in terms of what are the perspectives that you don't know when you're trying to do good. So I think I really firmly believe that it very much is about really getting into understanding your own, kind of the journey and learning and unlearning that we have to do individually, so that when you are trying to do good in whatever arena, you can actually understand what you aren't thinking of, right? And what are the stories that you're not hearing? What are the news articles that aren't making it to your feed, or things like that, right? And I think this is not only for the international context in terms of international development. I think it's all impact-oriented work in the domestic space as well. So yeah, I think over the years, especially this could be truly a full conversation in and of itself, but I think especially I ended up living in Nairobi for 4 years and several other countries abroad for about 10 years, and really witnessing some of the systemic systems at play, whether that was kind of just straight up racism, right? But when it came to kind of certain projects that only had local founders, would never get access to certain pitch days or pitch opportunities or things like that, versus if you had somebody from America or London that knew how to write the proposal in a way that that people might listen to, it can feel like a little bit of a hot button issue, but you really do see it on the ground play out over and over and over in terms of who are the entrepreneurs that are able to access capital, that are able to access networks, is very much often based on kind of the their own individual identities and privilege and power. And so I think it's I think that has also very much shaped my own very strong held views on the importance of just recognizing that there's a lot at play when we're trying to do good, and that doesn't mean that we shouldn't. We should be aware of everything. I don't know, as much as we can. We have to educate ourselves on what we might be inadvertently maybe perpetuating.
Yeah, so it really comes down more to self-education, not so much like real concrete policy changes per se, more of an awareness campaign, if I'm hearing you correctly.
Yeah, to me, that's the fundamental of it, because I think any policy would be a product of that, right? Because if we all were more aware of these various factors and these realities at an individual level and at a systemic level, the policy would come from that. But if not enough people recognize these realities, the policy will never be prioritized, right? Or it will never even be articulated. And so I think it's not the full answer, but I think it is like the most foundational piece of it.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, and I actually don't know if policy can't solve inherent human bias used as broadly as possible, right? Like, not talking justice factors, but bias just exists. That's just common. And I've had mentors who are investors, right? Where they say, like, the goal isn't to eliminate bias, because that's not humanly possible. The goal is to recognize and process out bias, right? And so that's not done via policy. That's done via that, I think, that awareness, right? That sort of recognition. And I do feel like we're seeing that some in the venture space, I think probably more than, project capital space, right? Is that sort of maybe underserved founders, right? Like the VCs think about it as a service provider for startup companies. And you see some of these geared towards underserved founders where there is more alpha to create. I don't know. I like, it depends on the week. I don't know about you. Are you optimistic or pessimistic now that you've been in this space so long?
Yeah. It's slower than I would like, right, in terms of the progress. So I don't think we can discount the progress that that is being made. I don't know that I would be as comfortable raising some of these issues as openly compared to 5-10 years ago. So I think the discourse definitely is kind of evolving in a way that is promising. But yeah, the activists in here, obviously wants it faster and bolder in terms of kind of just ensuring more equitable, just access, whether to basic kind of infrastructure or resources or whatever it is. But yeah, I mean, definitely overall optimist, or else I wouldn't be continuing to talk about it.
Yeah. Markets are big, unwieldy objects, so they take a long time, which can be painful. Okay, well, I'm sure we'll hear this theme again, I'm assuming, based on how you talk about it through your work. Yeah, you mentioned Nairobi, like you did Engineers Without Borders, you have this mechanical environmental engineering degree. What did you do with it?
Yeah. So basically after undergrad, I ended up, I was initially intending just to, go abroad for a year, work in a few countries, try to get a little bit of an understanding, and then come back for grad school or work. And then that 1 year abroad ended up turning into a decade, as it does. And so I ended up living and working in several different countries. So Kenya was one of the longest stints. Really just so grateful for my time there. Started out in Uganda, and then was also in India, Indonesia a little bit, and then ended up spending quite a bit of time in Europe after going to business school in Oxford. So I was able to spend some time in London for a few years, and then also was in Berlin. And ultimately, I think initially I was, especially coming kind of from that project background with Engineers Without Borders, I was really interested in kind of basic infrastructure and like specifically international development projects that are providing access to, whether it is basically providing access to basic human needs, whether that's water, food security, et cetera. And, the more and more I was working, whether in Uganda, India, Kenya, you couldn't really work in development without actually recognizing the gigantic growing elephant in the room that was climate. that was impacting things like water scarcity in Western India, where I was working in a small NGO, or looking at agricultural yields and impacts on that. And then all of the cascading effects on kind of market access and other issues that we know are so critical to the livelihoods of smallholder farmers. You could not work in development and work on, access to basic human needs for communities around the world without addressing the climate crisis, undermining decades of hard-earned development gains. And so that's kind of why, kind of very naturally, climate kind of became more and more front and center in kind of my my passions, my interests professionally. And then it's interesting. I actually kind of faced a little bit of a fork in the road academically, because for my master's I got into programs both for an MBA and for a master's of public health. And I was interested in both kind of tracks, and ultimately ended up picking the MBA route because the potential for financing to actually catalyze change and catalyze movement, I think was just a completely felt like it was at a completely different magnitude of opportunity that I could actually impact. Because I think ultimately, at the end of the day, I had seen kind of the disparities on the ground of resource allocations, and my kind of visionary dream was to be able to influence some of where those financial flows actually could go, right? And where to ensure that it was actually going to the communities most in need, or things like that. And so that's kind of where the MBA is kind of the track that I took, and then within that really focused on climate finance. And ended up working quite a bit on climate finance policy in the UK and in the EU through Mercy Corps, and based in London. And it was really, it's a very different discourse in Europe and in a lot of other countries where this is back in 2017, 2018, even back then, there was never a question of whether climate change was real, right? It was, even on the other sides of the political spectrum there, it was still not a question of whether it's real. It was, how should we address it? And so being able to work on climate policy and climate finance matters in those other countries, I think was really, just really, really illuminating and inspiring to see just how much, just how advanced some of the conversations were.
Interesting. Yeah. Why do you think that is? Not to put you on the spot.
It's a good question. I don't know that I have an answer to that. What I can say is that I don't think climate is unique in that sense, in having more of a scientific consensus being more of the mainstream. I think there's other issues on whether it's kind of social programs or other, just other approaches to kind of societal challenges. I think there's the discourse is just maybe a little bit just different. I feel like, and we have such a different history in the US and so many other kind of drivers that have brought us to, kind of the unfortunately very polarized reality that we're living in now. It's very I wish I had answers to that.
You must have some, I feel like you're trying to be you must have some hypotheses. I mean, you yada 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 over about 3 continents, and clearly made the choice to stay from 1 year to 10, which, although you said, as these things do, I don't think that's a common outcome for people. So you've had exposure in varying levels of sophisticated dialogue across really now 4 continents, and probably more. Well, El Salvador's 5. And you observed this distinction in dialogue at least 8 years ago on between these 2 continents. Like, what is it? Some function of our natural resource versus Europe, some function of like geographic diversity, some function of density, some function of education. Like, you must have some thoughts on how they got to a different place in the same global environment, right? Albeit with different history.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think educational factors are a huge driver. I think economic um, forces, right, in terms of kind of the amount of financial flows that can exist for certain interests, and the influence that they might have in political discourse or even in what then can trickle down to educational policy or kind of other interests. I think there's a lot of factors that have created this reality that we're in, and yeah, I mean, I think if we had the answers of how to address it and what kind of some of the root causes were, I would hope that we would be in a different place than where we are, right? I think a lot of this actually is kind of a product of so many different factors, but I think you're right. I mean, I think education, I think the amount of just the amount of I guess profits that can be made from certain sectors. You don't see similar regulatory environments, I'd say, and that's I don't want to make kind of blanket statements here, but I think the amount of profits that you might see.
Yeah, there's a strong financial incentive in the US. It's on a large hydrocarbon, like a very material set of hydrocarbon resources. And I generally think that's true. And I'll leave it at this because I don't know how, like, I don't think it's like a nefarious thing. I think it's just, again, coming back to our like natural human biases, right? That the marketplace will do what it can to maximize value. And even if at an individual level we say, oh, no, I would never do that, someone will, right? And so the ability to have that value drives an incentive structure that may or may not be the right answer. And so perhaps it's some combination of our natural resources and perhaps a cultural difference in Europe that is a little more state-centered, right? Like slightly more regulated and more, I don't know, more less laissez-faire sort of atmosphere. Maybe.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I guess just the one other cultural element I would add is one thing that I observed very clearly in all of the different countries in Europe that I spent time in was just a very kind of the default of kind of communal commons and just kind of community identity and kind of community-based community-centered actions and community-centered policy versus maybe more individually focused positioning and benefits. I think that is like a very fundamental difference in viewing of certain things, right? If you look at the Netherlands, they have their own history globally, but domestically right now, in terms of all of their practices around sustainability, a lot of it is only able to exist because of kind of the wider population's belief in the greater common good. Yeah. Whether it's kind of Amsterdam banning the use of or kind of mandating basically greater land area for bike use or other sorts of public transport. That type of policy can only exist if local communities are actually wanting that, right? Yep. And are prioritizing that. And I don't think it's a matter of right or wrong, right? I think it's just very different contexts. And I think that's been one thing that's been very, very, I guess, illuminating from the last, from my existence in the last like 10, 12 years internationally, is just really seeing up close, like, at the end of the day, we all want the same things in terms of, what we're looking for our families or for our loved ones. We just have different ideas of how we get there.
Yeah. No, it makes sense. Yeah, super interesting. Okay, I want to fast forward then to today. You said a comment, maybe or may not have been intentional, that you chose the MBA path to because you felt like you could make a difference allocating capital. And I feel like that's where the narrator would said, and that's exactly what she did, right? Tell us about the journey into IFC and or DFC, and what's it been like with your role there? Like, what exactly do you do, and like, has it met expectations, and what are you working on?
Yeah. Thanks so much. Yeah, no, it's been absolutely a dream to be able to work here. So I joined earlier on in the administration in April of 2021, and was able to kind of really be part of the thinking around, establishing the agency's climate strategy, establishing kind of our action plans related to it. DFC at that point had already made some of its larger climate commitments, whether that was, committing to having net zero emissions across our portfolio by 2040. The agency had also committed to having a third of all new transactions to be climate linked, along with a range of other commitments in this space. And those have really ended up being kind of a guiding star of what our day-to-day looks like, and what my day-to-day looks like really is thinking about kind of how the agency can and should be integrating climate across every one of its functions, right? And thinking about climate risk and climate opportunities for every single transaction as much as possible. Obviously, not all transactions will be climate transactions specifically, but to at least kind of consider the climate impacts is really quite critical. So yeah, it was pretty unexpected. I didn't really have any connections in Washington before this. I think is a little bit of luck involved in being able to get this role, but it's one that I've been really, really excited to be serving in. I definitely hustled quite a bit to get to get on some of the right radars, but yeah, it's been really cool. In terms of the day-to-day, I'd say it's really looking at how just integrating climate across every deal, and along with that, then trying to bring in as many new clients as possible that are working in climate, which is actually, it's a tough thing to find bankable opportunities in these various sectors that we're trying to expand.
Yeah, there's always the B word means different things to different people, and there's always sort of a natural gap, because if they were all sort of truly commercially bankable, we wouldn't actually need these organizations to help bridge it. Also, we'd sort of be on a different path around scalability, right? So, tell me. But before we get into that, tell me like what are you most proud of now over the last 2 years, like kind of setting this new trajectory? Like, is there a specific deal or a specific organizational moment, or like something that you have a little bit of a platform to brag? I'm going to force you to brag about yourself a little bit. Like, what are you most proud of over your last 2 years in the role?
No, thanks so much. So last year, so fiscal year 22 was not only the largest year of commitments for DFC, it was the largest year of commitments for climate, which was really, really cool. So we committed $2.3 billion in climate-linked investments across the map, and this kind of spanned a wide range of sectors. We've been really, really adamant about taking a view broader than just clean energy. Clean energy is absolutely fundamental, but we recognize that there are other areas and other sectors that are really critical in the climate space, whether that is energy efficiency, industrial decarbonization, food security, agriculture, nature-based solutions. And so this number that we hit, obviously, it's not just about kind of the volume of dollars out the door. It's also the quantity, the quality, and kind of the communities that it's serving. But in terms of the scale of operations, that's been something that's been really, really exciting. And I think for me personally, I'm really eager and committed to figure out how to ensure that 2.3 billion is a baseline, right? Obviously, don't quote me on that as an official kind of an agency commitment, but personally, it's really exciting to have that high of a figure to be what we can lean on, right? As our success in the last year, because that was basically the first full year that I was in office, that our chief climate officer was in office, that our office even existed in terms of kind of the full fiscal year. And so that's in terms of numbers, that's been really exciting. The other types of transactions that have been really, really cool, we really can't take credit for it ourselves as the climate folks, but as DFC, there are a few debt for nature swaps that have closed in recent years that have been, and in the last, since we've been in office, the one just in May of this year was a deal in Galapagos that was basically able to refinance over $1.6 billion in the country's sovereign debt to be able to actually establish over $400 million in conservation financing and marine protection for the Galapagos Islands. So that's one, and DFC was basically involved in providing the political risk insurance that was able to catalyze the private capital. And so I think I've been really proud and really excited about some of the culture shift that is happening within the agency to really kind of drive more and more towards climate and innovation, and really thinking about, even though even though there are always ways to improve and get better and get faster and scale, I think conversations around climate are not just kind of the last thing on the list. They are often very central to questioning about kind of the project's viability, or kind of the risk appetite that DFC should be taking for various sectors, or also kind of technologies, for example, in energy that DFC should be diversifying into, right? Very recently, we did commit, or we did announce kind of initial diligence on a green hydrogen project in Egypt, right? Or we've also been involved in geothermal projects in different parts of the world, and so really looking at kind of a broader portfolio, and really kind of working towards diversifying that in a really intentional way, and to be able to kind of establish what are those sectors, what are those targets, and being able to drive the agency towards that.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, 2.3 billion is a pretty good starting point. Don't set the bar too high for yourself. Well, tell us what some of those, you mentioned a couple: hydrogen, geothermal. Like, what are the more for the folks listening, like, what are the sectors that you're looking at, and like, who should pick up the phone and call you?
Yeah. No, I mean, so, as I mentioned, so obviously anything in the renewables space, so solar, wind, green hydrogen, geothermal, as I mentioned, we do have, we do have a strong interest in electric mobility, in industrial decarbonization, agriculture, food security, water access, water infrastructure, really kind of a wide range, nature-based solutions, sustainable forestry. Obviously, anything in the debt for nature swap space is also very much of interest. We are kind of one of the only agencies in this space, or financing entities really, that is doing such innovative transactions at scale. So we're really excited to continue doing that. I'd say in terms of products, I think people should just be aware of kind of what our rules are, right? So we can operate in, our mandate is to operate in low and lower middle income countries, right? We partner with private sector entities that are addressing the most pressing development challenges. Climate is a huge area of priority, and so kind of those sectors that I mentioned, they're not exclusive by any means, but projects in those spaces are very much of interest, and we're eager to hear from you. So please do reach out. But we are looking at other sectors, whether that's in health or ICT or infrastructure, and also thinking about how projects like that can be more climate aligned. But yeah, so lower and lower middle income countries, we do not require a US nexus in terms of kind of having a US company involved. Obviously, there is a preference for that, but that's not actually a legal requirement, as was the case with our predecessor agency. And then, just in terms of kind of the products that we offer, you can think of us as kind of like a full suite financial institution. So we offer debt, we offer indirect and direct equity, we offer political risk insurance, technical assistance. Our technical assistance is a little bit unique. It has to be tied to kind of follow-on financing. We offer guarantees, and the scale of financing is really quite wide. So, especially on the loan side, we can go as low as $1 million per individual transaction, all the way up to 1 billion for our debt and for guarantees. So it's really kind of spanning the full range of like large infrastructure finance to direct equity investments in more innovative solutions that might need that riskier capital.
Yeah, how do you think about that's fascinating that it's that broad. I knew some of those things. How do you think about functioning as a senior lender and a direct equity I mean, that is like opposite ends of the risk return curve. So like, how as an institution do you think about allocating between those two baskets?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a process, and it's one that we're learning because actually, so we became DFC through the Build Act of 2019, and before that, we did not have direct equity authority. So that is very much a new muscle for us that we are learning to build and then learning to use. I'd say it is it's something that is very much in progress, right? And it's something that we are really figuring out how we can learn and deploy more across. But I'd say debt has very much been our bread and butter for decades. But I think kind of with that authority that was granted to us, I think that was also in recognition of the need for financing institutions like us to be able to kind of catalyze greater capital into markets, to sectors, to various technologies that really needed it. And so we're building that. We are building our Office of Equity and Investment Funds, and yeah, are eager to really kind of make sure that DFC is as strongly positioned as possible to meet the needs of the future, right, and not of the decades past.
Yeah, that's super exciting. Yeah, there's a clear gap for that equity piece, right? Like, it's one thing to be a senior lender and like, okay, I've got pretty good collateral and you can price things in tens and 50s of basis points, but the equity, especially like project equity, is just it's sort of figuring out its way a little bit. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think there's no template yet, and is certainly blocking scale from my perspective, at least. So it's fascinating to think about an institution like yours that has these connections, right? Like, is much better than a private organization to engage with all of these geographies, and then to be able to sort of leverage the size of the balance sheet, because that's another thing too, right? If you're making big checks in project equity, like you can only do that, right? It's like betting on black and roulette, right? You can only do that so much because it just doesn't scale well unless you have sort of the size that you do. So that's fascinating. And are you able to drive, like you mentioned some things with Engineers Without Borders, like do you feel like now, given that history, you're able to sort of drive some of these potential solutions and education that you were focused on?
Yes and no. I mean, I think, the agency we are a government institution. There are a lot of for really good reason, helpful processes that are established on, establishing kind of what criteria is needed and kind of what type of documentation is needed for screening, for credit committee or investment or for board approval. I think there's really helpful kind of frameworks in place for how projects are diligenced and kind of really considered. I'd say I end up focusing when I think about kind of some of those realities. I try to think about it more in terms of who are the folks that we can bring into the door more, rather than, because I don't think it's, especially as the U.S. government, as the DFC, we thankfully, and especially in the climate space, we are not really constrained when it comes to the capital that we can deploy in these projects. And so it's not really a matter of trying to not invest in certain opportunities or certain groups or something like that. For me, it's really about how can we bring even more people to the table, because the table is ever expanding, right? Especially with our model, because we are kind of we are not a grant making institution. We do have returns that we provide to the U.S. Treasury. Like the pie is growing, and so I think it's really a matter of figuring out who else can and should we be bringing to the table and working towards that.
Yeah,
and I think that's very much the privilege of being in such a large institution, but that really is the power of it, right?
Right, an opportunity to leverage that for betterment of everyone. Yeah, very cool. Okay, we're running up a little bit on time. What have we not talked about that we should?
In terms of the work, I don't know. I think when it comes to DFC, it's just such, in terms of kind of the unique values of it, I think the potential for mobilizing private capital, I think, is just such an important role that we can play, right? If there are sectors or projects that maybe the private sector is deeming too risky, it's so critical for institutions like ours to be able to de-risk those types of opportunities to crowd in the private sector, because no public budget has enough funding to address the climate crisis or to facilitate the transition to a just energy economy, right? And so the role of mobilizing private capital, I think, is such an important one. And I think kind of alongside that, the value that we bring in investments relating to high environmental and social standards is just really, I think is just really critical when you think about kind of the climate action and climate finance space more broadly. Those are the main ones that come to mind.
Yeah. And for mobilizing private capital, like how do you think about that? Like your first money in, and that gives confidence to private markets, or do people come to you and be like, hey, I've got like someone's willing to put debt in this, or someone's willing to like put a little bit of equity in this. Would you do XYZ?
Yeah, it really depends on the project, right? So, and the tool that we're using. So like our political risk insurance tool that I mentioned was used in the debt for nature swaps. That insurance wrap that we provided actually enhanced the credit of the debt that was being refinanced. And only because of that credit enhancement was it attractive enough for private sectors to.
I see. Yeah,
right?
So you think about the non-debt and equity products as really your tool. That makes sense.
Yeah. And then also, I mean, for a project to have a US government investment, and even if it's a smaller ticket debt ticket, that obviously, kind of can enhance the credibility and perceived stability of the project. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of different ways that we're able to think about that, and especially on the mobilizing side too.
And is that part of the conversation? Like, is it a rigorous economic underwriting, or are there projects or opportunities where you're like, hey, this probably would be outside of our risk bound, but we have some portion of like, I don't know if it's higher risk, or like there's some political or strategic incentive to put a little bit like into this project, knowing that like there's still more work to do, or right? Like, you see what I'm saying? Like, is that part of the decision-making framework?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a pretty rigorous process, both in, our Office of Development Policy is looking at things like environmental and social safeguards, but also very much looking at economic impacts, looking at, kind of US effects of investments abroad. There's really quite rigorous analysis in place for all of it.
Fascinating. Yeah, super cool. Okay, and then I don't like saying last question, but probably last question. What are you most excited about as you look forward from your chair for the next 5 years?
That's not a small question, my friend. Yeah, I don't know. I think, there's a few different ways to answer that, but I'd say that it's really, really motivating to see just how mainstream the discourse around the climate crisis is becoming, and the need for people to do and work on it in any way they can, regardless of what work they might be doing. And so, the IPCC reports have demonstrated to us over and over that every fraction of a degree matters, that we can impact. Every dollar that we can catalyze matters truly in the livelihoods of entire communities. And so I think the mainstreaming of it finally, I think, is really very much a breath of fresh air, and hopefully we can kind of make sure that stays the case, regardless of how kind of conversations evolve. And I'd say that the other piece that also is really encouraging is I think my personal vision for the future of climate action is very much rooted in justice, right? And kind of those conversations that we started out with, right? Given kind of the legacies of various histories that have led to where we are in terms of the disparities that we have, but also recognizing how central some of that discourse has become. We saw that in some of the COP27 negotiations in Sharm el Sheikh regarding loss and damage, and all of kind of those elements. So I think the fact that we have so much finally culminating in a sector that is just so critical for our future as people, as the planet, I think is just really really motivating.
Amazing. Well, I'm so glad you're in your chair to impact this change. I can't wait to see all that you accomplish.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thanks for coming on.
Our leadership in science and industry, our hopes for peace and security, our obligations to ourselves as well as others, all require us to make this effort, to solve these mysteries, to solve them for the good of all men and for the progress of all people.